Oh, it's a deep burn!
This video is about 5 of the most common sports injuries and how to prevent them. I'm going to tell you how and why these injuries occur in the first place, and list the most effective movements, exercises, stretches, and drills that will help prevent these injuries from happening. The injuries I'm going to cover are muscle pulls, neck strains, frozen shoulder, lower back injury, and tennis elbow.
Hi everybody. So the first injury that I'm going to talk about is muscle pulls. Just a really simple injury that can happen to really any part of your body, whether it's the hamstring or the neck. Really any muscle in your body can be pulled. Now, what is a muscle pull? A muscle pull is basically a small tear. Now, if you have an injury to your muscle and you go to the doctor and you have it looked at and he says, well, that's a torn muscle, really the only difference between a muscle tear and a muscle pull is severity. The mechanism of injury, when you really get down to the cellular level, or at least the tissue level, when you look at the fibers, it's just a difference of degree, not kind. So when you have a muscle pull, you've torn some of the fibers, some of the little cross bridges, the little myofilaments that overlap and allow your muscle to contract. You've torn some of those. So that can be very, very mild to very severe depending on how many of those cross bridges have been torn. So when you pull a muscle, why that happens is due to a lot of factors. In general, it's from not being warmed up. It can also be from overuse, just from doing the same motion over and over again. You can create a situation where the muscle is going to tear. It's just or be pulled. It's just very fatigued. There's a lot of tissue level strain there, and it's been built up over time because you keep doing the same motion over and over again. Like in sports, that happens a lot. You know, whether it's a tennis serve, swinging the racket overhead, doing that over and over again, you're constantly lengthening out these tissues repeatedly and creating a lot of fatigue there over and over, and that can set up a situation for a muscle pull. But more generally, it's from muscle that's cold, not warmed up yet, being acted on very suddenly and very ballistically. So the way to prevent that from happening is by warming the tissues up fully before you start doing your sport. So generalized warm up is a really good way to start the routine. 5 to 10 minutes of cardiovascular activity, something that's going to increase your heart rate, something that you're going to break a sweat doing. And you can achieve that a number of different ways. You can do it by jogging, jumping rope, rowing on the ergometer. It doesn't matter. Anything that you can keep a steady pace going for that length of time for your warm up, that's going to raise your body temperature, but you're not killing yourself because it's just a warm up. You don't want to waste all your energy for that you're going to use for your sports training or your workout, and you don't want to have an injury. You don't want to have to warm up for your warm up. So a mild, moderate intensity gets the heart flowing, and then after that, then you can do some more dynamic flexibility, some sports specific movement that's going to prepare you for whatever your workout is. And that's a great way to prevent muscle pulls. So aside from that, another general tip is to start with easier exercises, lower intensity movements, and progress towards harder ones so that you have a chance to gradually warm up. In addition to that, static stretching has been shown to uh, help help with that, preventing muscle pulls. So just simple static stretching after your warm up, if it's not too extensive, can help, and also dynamic stretching, which are things like leg swings or Just simple movements like arm circles like this, or there's different variations. Things like this help loosen up and stretch the area you're trying to work without being static. Like an example of a static stretch would be a hamstring stretch like this, keeping the legs straight, bending forward, trying to stretch the back of the legs. Now you can bend forward more at the waist like this, but now I'm not stretching my hamstrings anymore. I'm getting the same benefit here with my back flat. This is just stretching my lower back. So focusing on keeping the legs straight and bending at the hips, not the back. As an example, also quadricep stretches or stretches for the rear shoulder. These are just some examples of static stretches that you can do. And all of those things will help prevent muscle pulls. Okay, so the next injury is neck strain. And so something I want to address first is that term, because some people may pull a muscle in their neck and say, well, I strained my neck. Technically speaking, those terms mean different things. A pull, as I discussed earlier, is when you have a partial or some degree of tearing of the muscle fibers. A strain is in the tendon. And then you have sprains, which are ligamentous injuries. So a strain is in the tendons. As far as straining or pulling the muscle in the neck, the mechanism is pretty much the same. And it can happen in overhead type motions, such as tennis serve, when the tennis player goes to reach up overhead and they throw their ball up in their serve and they're looking up to make contact with that ball. Or this can also happen in outside of sports, in work or daily life. If you're just reaching overhead to get something, because we don't do that motion very often, we tend to be tight in our upper back and our neck from just our sitting type of culture, being seated and in this kind of hunched posture. So when we go overhead, we end up tweaking something in our neck because of that adaptive shortening. So that's one reason why that happens. But certainly a repetitive overhead motion where we're looking up, and even just in an acute sense, hyperextending the neck in this position can cause pinching of the nerves and also just shortening of the muscles and straining of the tendons there. So how do we prevent that? Well, one thing to do is stretch the neck. If we have a tight neck, then we can stretch it. One way to do that is by bringing the head forward and back. And a lot of sources say avoid circular motions when you're in the extended position back here, not to do this as I do it, because of the shape of the cervical spine and where the nerves come out of the cervical spine. There's more of a chance of impinging them when you do that motion. So most sources on exercise in sports science literature say that moving in the frontal plane, side to side like this, or in the sagittal plane, rocking back and forth like this is fine. Even semicircular motions in the front is perfectly okay and will help loosen up the muscles of the neck and strengthen them to some extent and help prevent those type of injuries, strains, and pulls. One more thing that you can do for your neck is to strengthen it directly with resistance training. Now they have different harnesses that they sell, or you could make one if you're a do-it-yourselfer, where they attach to the head and then have straps that hang down that you can attach to weight plates. And you would get in kind of a forward bent posture like this with that harness on your head, the weight hanging below, So the weight's hanging off your neck, and then move into flexion, and then you're going to extend the neck against that resistance that's pulling down on your neck. And that would obviously work the extensors, which are one of the muscles that get strained from doing this motion. So another exercise you can do for the front of your neck, the flexors, is to lie down on a bench, preferably, or you could do it on the floor, facing up, and have some type of weight, a plate or a dumbbell, whatever it is. You can have some type of pad on your head, a towel works well. Rest the weight on your forehead, stabilize it with your hands. You're going to have your neck straight, which is why bench works good, because you can move into extension more, get more of a full range of motion on your neck, but you've got to be careful with that. And then flex the neck and use the neck muscles to bring the weight up. And obviously you want to start with a light weight, be conservative with that, and work higher repetitions. Don't try to do a 1 rep max for that. You want to work higher repetitions, especially the first time you do it, because believe me, your neck muscles will be really sore, because we don't normally, most people anyway who are exercising or doing sports don't work that muscle under load like that, so you want to be careful. But that works the neck flexors, and just building a good base of support. Think of those muscles that wrap around your neck, like your core, like your trunk muscles, and they do the same thing that your abs do, and your obliques and your spinal erectors do for your uh, lumbar spine, as your neck muscles do for your cervical spine. So if you strengthen them, you'll have a more stable neck, and it'll be more resistant to injury and strain. Alright, next is the frozen shoulder. Now, what is that? Frozen shoulder is a condition where we can't go through full range of motion on the shoulder. When we abduct our arm away from our center line, like this, it's really just the humerus, the upper arm, moving in the shoulder socket until we get to about here. After that, to go any higher, we have to start rotating the scapula. So as I move above about a 90-degree angle, or parallel to the ground, my scapula is going to start, if you could see it like this, it's going to start rotating out that way. And that's so the head of my humerus doesn't run into the acromion process on my scapula and cause impingement there. But one of the major muscles that allows me to do that is my upper traps. Now, there's a nerve that comes down on either side of the cervical spine called the spinal accessory nerve, or cranial nerve 11. And that innervates the trapezius. And when we have a forward head posture like this, kind of kyphotic, that nerve gets pinched, and it cuts off the blood flow, and that nerve doesn't innervate those muscles as well, so it doesn't activate them as well. So when I go to move overhead, the traps won't fire because that nerve is pinched, and I can't move my shoulder any higher. And well, obviously that's not good. That's going to cause problems with performance, maybe even lead to an injury, or certainly pain, from not being able to go through my normal range of motion. So how do we prevent that? Well, one of the first things you want to address in that situation is just normal posture, whether it's sitting or standing. If we're in this position, like our mom always says, you want to stand up straight. Well, she was right. If you're like this, in this position, this hunch posture, which we tend to be in a lot when we're sitting, or when we're driving, or even when we're standing sometimes, unless we really think about it, to bring the chest up, pull the shoulders down and back, and lift up from the crown, so that we have a good standing posture. So thinking about that will get us out of that position and lessen the likelihood that we're going to have a pinching on that nerve. And it also has other accessory benefits of lessening the load on the cervical spine from not having as much torque, there's a line called the plumb line, where we have a string with a weight hanging from the ceiling, and it comes down and it bisects our body on this frontal, or excuse me, sagittal plane, rather. And there's a bunch of places it lines up with. I'm not going to talk about those, but at the top, it will be right behind the opening of the ear. It should be, if it's and when it's in line with everything else. For every inch forward that we come past that plumb line, every inch I come this way, I'm adding 10 pounds of force to the muscles of my neck. So I'm making my muscles work a lot harder all the time just to maintain that position. So by coming out of that position, having good posture, we put less strain on our neck, and we have less likelihood of impinging that nerve and causing a frozen shoulder. So how can we help strengthen that even more? Well, we want to work on the muscles that let us hold that position. So rhomboids, our middle trapezius, well, the whole trapezius really, when that fires, will help pull it back, and our spinal erectors also helps extend the trunk, keep our chest up, which is going to allow us to keep the head back. And also neck flexors, which I talked about with the neck flexion exercise, laying face up, supine, and flexing the neck under weight. Those are all good things. Now, for exercises specifically, working some scaption exercises, either with weight or without, holding the hands this way. This is actually a good warm-up exercise. Coming away from the center line, lifting, trying to lift with the shoulders, pinching the shoulder blades at the top, pinching them together like you're trying to squeeze a pencil between the shoulder blades. And this can be done with weight or with body weight. Can be done with dumbbells. It can also be done with resistance bands. Band pulls are also good for this. Holding a resistance band out like this, keeping the arm straight, pulling back. This works your posterior deltoid as well, but what we're trying to focus on right now is the benefit to the rhomboids and the middle traps by squeezing the shoulder blades together. This can also be done at a slightly different angle overhead, squeezing down, and we contract, pinching the shoulder blades together. And that's a couple exercises you can do for your posture, help keep your shoulders back. One more and I'm going to show you one more for the lower back. Alright, so this exercise is for, I said your lower back, but I should have said spinal erectors, because these muscles, as a muscle group, go up and down the entire spine, kind of like two sets of cables running parallel to the spine. So this can be done just on the floor. If you have something like this, or you're in a gym setting, you can do them in back extension machines, or a glute ham raise machine. It's the same thing. But if you have one of these at home and then you've got something you can anchor your feet under, that's really the best way to do this. It lets you get out further over the ball. But for demonstrations purposes, I don't have that. But basically, coming forward over the ball and extending up. And as I said, you would want to be further over the ball this way. So I would want to have the ball lower and my feet anchored so that I could hang further in front. But there's also a simpler body weight version. Well, that's body weight too, but no equipment option. Just laying on the floor, doing Supermans. Hands out, feet straight, arching up, and coming down.
So when you're in that up position, that's where the benefit of the exercise is. It's a very short range of motion, which is why having a ball or in a gym back extension machine is better, because you can get a more full range of motion, but this still lets you target those spinal erector muscles and get some benefit.
Okay, lower back injury. Now, this is something that most people are at least a little familiar with. Um, Even young people today, like myself, can experience back pain, and it's something that's really common. And but more so as you get older, it tends to be more common. There's a lot of it in sports too. Even though you have really active people that are very fit, still have a lot of lower back issues. Why does that happen? Well, again, you can have strains and pulls. You can have muscular injury to the lower back. You can have a tendinous or ligamentous injury. You can have slipped discs. You can have all number of different things. A lot of times, what happens when it's an acute injury, though, in sport, is from a quick movement that is unexpected. When a football player gets hit from an angle he didn't see coming, or if you are in the weight room lifting and you're trying for a PR on deadlift and your focus isn't all there, or maybe your foot slips and you get a slight twisting motion with that fast movement and your back goes out, or something like that. Or you're just walking to your car and it's winter and you slip on some ice and your body makes a sudden quick movement and you pull something in your back as it tries to contract to protect itself. And that's a mechanism of injury for a lot of different types of injuries in different parts of the body, is falling. When the body tries to contract to stop it, the muscle contracts to stop it from lengthening too quick, and that causes a muscle pull. So that's actually very common. Another way that these things happen is from muscle imbalance. What do I mean by that? I mean, sometimes we have very weak muscles on one side and too strong or too tight muscles on another side. Or in general, we have a core that is too weak and too lax, and it doesn't have enough strength to protect us, especially during athletic motions in sport, which are very demanding on our core. And anything that happens to our core gets transferred to our spine, and that can result in injury a lot of the time. Another thing that can cause a lower back injury is very tight hip flexors. I just mentioned this non-specifically, but a specific muscle that can be over tight and happens to be, in a lot of cases, in a lot of the research I've seen and just personal experience, I have noticed that people tend to get tight hip flexors in all walks of life, whether they're athletic or not, because almost all people spend a great amount of time sitting. And when you're in a seated posture, the hip flexors are in a shortened position. So when we stand up or we're in any type of lunge, then we're lengthening that past its set point where it's really comfortable, even though if we kept them stretched out, it wouldn't be. It shouldn't be that much. But since it's so used to being here, when we ask it to be in the neutral position, the anatomical position, it's already stretched out. And then it only takes a sudden pull or an unexpected amount of force or a quick contraction, and we can pull it. Not only that, but those muscles, the hip flexors or the psoas major, the iliopsoas, connect to the lumbar spine on the front. So when those are tight, they're pulling forward on the lower back. They're trying to pull us into this spinal extension, and that puts strain on our lower back. So tight hip flexors are a really a really common problem that results in lower back pain. So how can we address these issues? Well, the first thing is strengthening the muscles. I'll address that. Strengthening the muscles is fairly easy. If the core is simply weak, and that's what's causing the lower back injury, there's all number of core exercises out there. Again, the Swiss ball, fine piece of cheap equipment that you can use to do different core exercises. Of course, these could be done on the floor, but simple crunches, doing them at different depths and heights, depending on what range you want to train, can be effective for strengthening the rectus abdominis, the six-pack muscles, basically. But it's important to know that once I come up past here, once I start to flex my hips, now I'm working the hip flexors again. So right now I'm not trying to address the hip flexors, I'm trying to strengthen the rectus abdominis to help basically give me that corset of muscle around my core that will help stabilize the spine and prevent lower back injuries that way. So I'm not trying to train the hip flexors with this exercise necessarily. This is just for the rectus. So I don't need to come up all the way. And that goes for the same thing if I've got my feet anchored or whether I'm doing them on the floor or whatever. So there's all different types of ab exercises, but that's one key point I just want to bring up is that crunching motions, although a lot of people are against them, that motion is going to train the rectus. Sit-ups, when you're flexing the hip, mostly going to be using the hip flexors to do that motion. The rectus will be working to stabilize your upper body as you bring your trunk off the ground, but it's not going to be the prime mover, essentially. Now, it's important to hit the whole core. You don't want to be strong here and weak on the sides. You want the whole canister, all sides of it, to be strong. It'd be like the trunk of a tree and 3/4 of it are missing and it's only got this one side. That tree's going to fall over. So you want to have your whole core strong. Now for the sides, you can do side crunches, you can do side leg lifts, you can do twisting motions like the Russian twist or a captain's chair where you're sitting in the captain's chair like this. I'm just going to do it with one leg because I'm not magic right now, I can't do it with two, but you bring your leg up to the side, to the middle, and then obviously to the other side as well, and that would be both legs coming to the sides and to the front. That will train your hip flexors, but at the top, if you roll the hips, it'll hit the abs, and it'll also get the obliques, internal and external, from doing rotation. For the back, that's still part of your core, the spinal erectors, you can do, as I said before, Supermans, back extensions, things like that. Reverse leg lifts, all those different things will help train the spinal erectors, because if that area is weak, it's definitely going to cause a lower back injury. If those muscles aren't strong, then they cannot contract to prevent an hyperflexion of the lower spine, which can certainly lead to slip disc or other spinal injuries. Okay, one more thing. So that's strengthening, and another huge aspect of preventing lower back injury is having things be stretched enough, having your muscles be flexible enough. So, like I said before, hip flexors being tight is a huge problem for lower back pain. What you want to do is have them be nice and stretched out and flexible. There's not a whole lot of variations of this. Pretty much any lunge or type movement is going to stretch the hip flexors on the leg that's back. So if you move into a lunge, focus on pushing the hip forward on the back leg. If I come forward like this, I'm taking the pressure off that hip flexor.
flexor. So you want to push the hip forward. You don't have to arch back. That's not important. The hip needs to be forward. And you should feel it right in the front of the leg. And this is after, again, after you warm up will be the most effective time to do static stretching. You could also do leg swings, focusing on the back part of the swing to help with loosening up the hip flexors as well. And of course, make sure you do both sides, because you want to keep both of them loose. And that is a huge part of keeping the lower back pain-free. Also, hamstrings being tight can throw off the pelvic tilt, as well as tight rectus fem or hip flexors. And also internal and external rotation can affect that. So for internal and external, you can do a simple exercise called windshield wipers. This is to loosen up the internal rotators, dropping the knee to the inside, keeping that sit bone, your ischium on the side that's dropping the knee, flat on the floor, because if I rotate my hips, I'm not going to feel the stretch. Drop the knee to the inside, to the other side. I can do this as a mobility drill for more of a dynamic warm-up, or I can hold it statically as a static stretch, trying to drop that knee. But make sure it doesn't hurt in your knee when you do this. Just feel this in the hip and not the knee. Move back here a little bit so you can see a little better. So dropping the knee to the inside, to the outside. Bring the leg to the inside. In yoga, they call this pigeon, but if you're not into yoga, you don't have to think of it that way. Again, you want to drop the bent leg, hip down, back leg hip, turn it over so you're not rotating away, and then try to tuck your tailbone underneath. You should really feel that in the front leg on the outside of the hip. So if we stretch the hip so that it's nice and mobile, that will help our lower back to be stable. If the lower back is stable, it's less likely to be injured when it tries to move in a way it shouldn't. The hips, especially the hip flexors, will really help loosen that anterior pull on the lower back, keeping it more relaxed, more stable, and less likely to get injured. Okay, the last injury or condition that I want to talk about is tennis elbow. And I've had this a few times in my life, and I'm sure some of you have, and it's not fun to deal with. Tendinitis is just an inflammation of the tendon around the joints. And it can happen from repetitive use, or over tightness in a muscle, or muscle imbalance can lead to it. And it happens a lot in sports or activities where there's a lot of grabbing, where you have to grab a lot. There's a lot of activation of the forearm flexors, and you have to squeeze things a lot. And that's pretty much all racket sports, golf even. Well, obviously tennis, racquetball, maybe badminton. I'm not sure how hard those guys are swinging, but I'm sure it could happen in badminton too. And not even in all racket sports. I mean, outside of that, people who just are on the computer a lot, typing, or even weightlifters who take care of themselves, lift a lot of weights, and are very strong, can still get that. So why is that? What's happening? Well, tennis elbow specifically speaks to tendinitis on the inside, or medial epicondylitis. Golfer's elbow is tendinitis on the lateral side, and that's what distinguishes between them. It's the same thing going on as far as biologically or physiologically. It's an inflammation of those tendons. There's flexors, wrist flexors here, and they insert on a common flexor tendon on this side, on the medial side near the elbow. And that's what tennis elbow is. It's inflammation from so much of this, just constantly squeezing. So how do we prevent that? Well, the main thing is, what really helped me was stretching. And as an aside, I haven't been addressing what you do if you do get it through this video, but if you do have tendinitis, rest and ice is your best friend. Localized ice.
ice for 15 minutes off, 15 minutes on, 15 minutes off for an hour. And if you can, do that 2 or 3 times a day. Take NSAIDs like ibuprofen and rest it. Don't do anything. And again, disclaimer, I'm not a doctor. Ask your doctor. Don't take this as medical advice. This is just what I did, and it helped me. Now that being said, the other thing was stretching. Okay, the inflammation happens when it gets just really tight and irritated. It'd be like if somebody asked you to scrunch up all your muscles like this and walk around like this all day, you wouldn't be very happy because you're going to be extremely uncomfortable. And that's what's happening to the tendon. It's just being pulled on all the time by those shortened muscles, and it doesn't like it. So it gets irritated. It tells you, hey, this doesn't feel good. So stretching is a huge thing. If you're starting to get the symptoms, or if you want to prevent it, stretch them out before your workout. After you warm up, stretch out those flexors. And that's to prevent that adaptive shortening. Even more important to do it after your workout. If you're doing anything where you're grabbing a lot, whether you're lifting weights or playing a racket sport or anything like that, with using your hands a lot. Simple stretches, okay? You can hold your arm like this, elbow fully extended. Some of them are going to be maybe felt better this way in an anatomical position. You can also try it this way. But I'm still, notice I rotated my wrist, but I'm still stretching the flexors. Still extending the wrist, pulling and holding that. And just to balance things out, you can stretch this way, and you're stretching the extensors. It's good to balance them out. But that brings me to another point. What happens on the other side of the coin is that the extensors are weak, and they lose the battle. So you have a muscle imbalance because these cannot keep up with these. We don't do a lot of forceful wrist extension or opening the hand to do things. Anytime we manipulate anything, whether it's a weight or a piece of equipment for our sport or just something in our daily life, we're grabbing it, we're typing, we're picking things up, whatever we're doing this. And we only do this to open our hand to grab something else. So we don't have to do this under a load very often. So working those is very important for maintaining the balance of the wrist joint and then the hands and just your hand health and the elbow health. So what can we do for that? Well, one thing we can do is, this is just for demonstrations, there are pieces of equipment like this. I've seen them manufactured, but if you just have a dowel and a piece of cord or string tied to this and hanging down, tied to a weight, and hold this out in front of you, and you're going to move it like this, and you'll have to use your imagination. As you're doing this, you start wrapping that string around the dowel, and it starts lifting that weight. So if I'm doing it this way, as I'm doing that motion, I'm doing a wrist extension. So this is going to be higher rep type training, which is good for these muscles because they're small and they're more red fiber. So they respond better to higher repetition anyway. You don't need to be doing 1 rep max, finger openers under load, or doing this for 1 rep. It's not going to work. Also, if I was seated and I had my forearms like this out over my knees, and I could do wrist curls this way, reverse wrist curls with a barbell or an easy curl bar, whatever. And that you could use a little more weight on that and work those extensors. So that will definitely help with maintaining the balance of the wrist and preventing that inflammation on the front and help you prevent that. Doing some of these things before you get injured
is the best way to stop yourself from getting injured. If you wait until you get injured, then you've got to take a different route. And an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, as they say. So doing this before you get injured will make your life so much easier, and you can take that from me from experience. If you do this before you get injured, it's going to save you a lot of hassle down the road, especially with things like tendonitis, which mine took about a year to finally go away, and that's all my fault from not taking care of it right. So definitely with the tennis elbow in particular, you've got to rest it if you get it, and to prevent it, make sure you stretch those flexors. And if you can work in some wrist extension into your workouts just at the end of your workouts, it's going to pay off a lot. That's one of those exercises that really helps when you do it in small amounts. You don't have to you don't have to do a whole workout. If you're doing like a body part split, you're doing like chest and tri and then back. You don't have to have a day for wrist extensors. Just on one of your upper body days, just do like 3 sets of 20 at a moderate weight to finish your workout, and that's going to at least help. I mean, it's certainly a lot better than doing nothing. And that's like one of these other exercises. I'll throw this in now as a bonus for the frozen shoulder injury. When another part of that is laxity in the shoulder by the rotator cuff muscles. The infraspinatus and the teres minor definitely get left out a lot of times because they're very small muscles and they help us do external rotation. I've got this band hooked to a piece of equipment off camera you can't see, but it could be anything. It doesn't matter as long as it's anchored to something. So with a resistance band, or if you're in a gym, you can use a cable machine, holding it at a 90-degree angle. So we're focusing just on the external rotation at the shoulder, just externally rotating the upper arm. Focuses the work on those muscles, the infraspinatus and the teres minor. Posterior delt is going to help a little bit with this too. That also helps with external rotation, but we can really focus on those muscles of the rotator cuff, which are very important, and these guys get just neglected and abused from all the pressing we do. Even our pulling motions, like anything with our lats, any pull-ups or rows, you think, well, I'm working my back, that's balancing it out, but even the lats insert on the front of the upper arm, the humerus, so when we pull, we're still internally rotating, and those little guys in the posterior delt have to fire to neutralize that unwanted accessory movement. So working this motion, really important, just like the wrist extension.
Oh, it's a deep burn.